The galaxy liked to pretend it was civilized. Marble halls floated in orbit around suns. Kings and queens of alien dynasties carried themselves in robes that shimmered like molten glass, and fleets glittered in the void like jeweled daggers. But underneath the silk and ceremony lay the same old instincts, arrogance, cruelty, and the belief that the weak could be broken without consequence. That belief was what led the Galactic Empire to harm a human girl who should have been untouchable. She was 22. To the Empire, that was little more than a hatchling age, soft-boned and impressionable. To humans, it was the dawn of adulthood, of Firebrand's years, the point where rebellion still burned bright, but wisdom had begun to sharpen. She was quick with her tongue, sharper with her eyes, and carried herself with the kind of confidence only someone raised under a dangerous father could. She bore her mother's smile, but her father's silence, and that mixture made her magnetic to those who didn't know better and terrifying to those who did. The Empire didn't know better. It began on a quiet station perched above a minor trade lane. The girl had been traveling alone, a rarity, but she wanted to see the galaxy her father had long avoided. She walked among species with names that curled like smoke, triarchs with crystalline skulls, molari who clutched scent tubes instead of weapons, Orions with long eye stalks that flicked like nervous fingers. She wore human clothes, leather jacket, boots scuffed from too many Earth sidewalks, a shirt with faded letters spelling out nirvana. Aliens thought her quaint, a novelty, a living exhibit from a backwater world. They laughed when she struggled with the vending machine that spat out cans of fizzing purple syrup, and they smirked when she muttered curses under her breath. She was still laughing herself when the guards appeared. The king's enforcers always made an entrance. Their armor was black as oil, their insignias burning red, and they carried shock staves that hummed with power. They shoved aside lesser species, sneered at station vendors, and moved like they owned every hallway. One saw her, saw the girl with the human jawline, the human swagger, and decided she was prey. The strike was fast, a crack across her ribs, a barked insult about primitive vermin daring to walk unescorted. She staggered, refused to bow, and that refusal sealed it. They beat her in the open, laughing as she spat blood, daring her to stand again. She did twice before they left her crumpled against the vending machine, coins still clutched in her hand. The station cameras recorded it all. The guards thought it entertainment. The Empire thought it irrelevant. But somewhere, in a cabin far from their shining halls, a man watched that recording. He sat at a wooden table scarred by time, a chipped mug of coffee steaming at his elbow, and a paperback novel lying open beside it. The man was unremarkable by galactic standards. No glowing eyes, no armored scales, no crown of telepathic spines. Just a human middle-aged, with dark hair gone salt at the temples and lines carved deep by years of silence. His shirt was plain, his posture easy, his expression calm. But when the recording ended, when his daughter's voice cracked through the speakers, crying out once, twice, then was silenced by fists, his eyes shifted. That look was older than empires. The galaxy called him many things, though never to his face. To some, he was the ghost. To others, the man in black. But to humans, especially the few who had seen him work, he was whispered as Baba Yaga. Not because he was a witch, nor because he rode in a cauldron of flame, but because he was the story you told children when you wanted them to fear the dark. The name had clung to him after old wars, after things no archive fully recorded. Aliens thought it quaint. Humans knew better. He set the mug down carefully, like it mattered not to spill. He slid the paperback closed and placed it on the table with reverence, marking the page with nothing but memory. Then he stood, slow, deliberate, and walked to a closet. Inside hung only one coat, black, heavy, worn. When he pulled it on, the cabin seemed to shrink. The quiet around him grew heavier, as though the air itself braced. He took no weapons from the rack, not yet. He simply stood there, breathing slow, letting the silence fill him until it was sharper than any blade. The news spread faster than light ever could. Whispers moved through smugglers, traders, mercenaries, and diplomats. The girl had been harmed, and the father had risen. At first, most laughed. The Empire's analysts scoffed. One human? A primitive soldier clinging to old legends? They filed him under cultural curiosity, dangerous only in reputation. They reminded each other that Earth had signed treaties, sworn oaths of peace, agreed to be contained within polite boundaries. But there were others, old veterans, gray-scaled or scarred, who had fought beside or against humans centuries ago. They did not laugh. They shivered. They whispered to their children to stay home, to avoid stations, to keep their heads low. Because they knew the truth hidden beneath every polite human smile. Violence was not an option for their kind. It was a language. Meanwhile, he moved. He boarded no flagship, carried no banners, sent no declarations. He arrived on a merchant hauler, quiet, polite, offering to help with loading crates. The captain thought him a drifter, paid him in spare meals, never knowing he was carrying a storm in human skin. At each stop, the man listened. He heard the gossip, tracked the movements of the king's enforcers, pieced together the map of arrogance that stretched across the stars. When he finally spoke, it was to a crewman who asked why he traveled with nothing but that old coat. The man smiled softly and said, "I don't need much, just a reason." The crewman didn't ask again. The first hints reached the Empire weeks later. A garrison of enforcers found their barracks empty of supplies, every ration gone, every weapon sabotaged. A patrol ship limped into port with its engines fused solid, the crew trembling too hard to explain why they had abandoned their posts at the sight of a lone figure on a docking bay. A noble's courier failed to arrive, his datapads intercepted. His guards found unconscious, stacked neatly like firewood. The reports confused the High Council. The humans were supposed to be unpredictable but contained, emotional but weak. Yet this one moved with purpose, precision, as though every step had been rehearsed centuries in advance. The Empire debated, dismissed, and delayed. They had wars to fight, rebellions to crush, taxes to collect. What was one man compared to a galaxy? But whispers have power. At a banquet of the king's inner circle, a Triarch ambassador lifted a crystal goblet and murmured, "The Baba Yaga walks again." The hall laughed nervously. The king smirked. "A bedtime story," he declared, toasting with jeweled arrogance. Humans break easily. Somewhere deep in the hall, a servant, human by the slant of his shoulders, by the silence of his steps, paused in pouring wine. His lips curved, just slightly, before he moved on. The girl, meanwhile, healed in a med bay, unaware her father's shadow was already stretching across star systems. She woke with bruises fading, ribs mended, heart still fierce. She asked no one for pity. She only asked who had laughed when she fell. And when they told her, she memorized each name. But she didn't need to seek vengeance. Vengeance was already moving, steady as tide. The man returned to his cabin once more briefly, to retrieve a single item from a locked chest. It wasn't a blade or a blaster, though both lay within. It was a simple silver locket, tarnished with age, inside of which rested a picture. The girl as a child, missing teeth, grinning wide, arms around a dog that had long since died. He touched the photo once, then tucked the locket inside his coat. His expression didn't change. His resolve already had. The Empire thought it had time. It did not. By the time the king realized his guards were vanishing, that stations had grown quiet, that whispers were replacing obedience, the man was already at his gates. Not to storm them yet, not to strike. No, he was patient. He lingered at the edges, testing the locks, mapping the guards' rotations, memorizing every exit. He smiled at vendors, helped aliens carry their groceries, bought flowers from children. To all appearances, he was nothing more than a wandering father seeking distraction. But in the silence of his rented room, he cleaned his weapons one by one. Not because he needed them, but because ritual mattered. The galaxy had mistaken humanity for domesticated beasts. And now, one man was about to remind them that humans were wolves who had learned to smile. The king's head still rested firmly on his shoulders. For now. But already, he felt the weight of eyes he could not see, the chill of footsteps echoing where none should. He dismissed it as paranoia. He raised his goblet higher, mocking stories of Earth. And far away, in the quiet of a starless void, Baba Yaga whispered to himself as he checked the final chamber of his pistol. "Now you've given me a reason." The Empire's mistake was assuming the human moved in anger. They thought fury made him reckless, predictable. But Baba Yaga did not storm palaces or shout vengeance into calms. He smiled, thanked dock workers, bought flowers from street vendors, and asked quiet questions that revealed everything he needed. What the Empire called vengeance, he called preparation. On a mining moon thick with dust storms, he worked beside Orion laborers, hauling crates heavier than any human should manage. He did it without strain, listening to their complaints about delayed pay, dwindling food, and guards who mocked their hunger. That evening, he played cards with them, losing on purpose, sliding rations their way when the overseers weren't looking. When one asked why he smiled so easily, he simply said, "Because every smile buys me time." The miners laughed, but they remembered. Weeks later, when the king's enforcers tried to march through that same moon, the miners vanished into tunnels, leaving traps primed. The human never gave the order. They had already chosen their side. On a space station orbiting a gas giant, he walked into a bar where mercenaries drank themselves stupid. They were Brivacs, reptilian brutes with thick hides and thicker skulls, hired often for intimidation but rarely for loyalty. He bought the first round, then the second, then told a story about Earth, about how humans once fought wars not for territory, but for pride, for insults, for the audacity of a look. The Brivacs laughed, teeth clashing against mugs, until he leaned closer and whispered, "Now imagine what we'll do for blood." No one laughed after that. The Empire began to notice oddities. Supply convoys vanished without distress calls. Weapon caches failed to respond to remote signals. Garrisons opened their lockers to find ammunition replaced with stones, rations with earth candies wrapped in mockery. Someone had scrawled words in human script on the walls of a barracks. "Knock, knock." The soldiers had no idea what it meant, but they flinched at every door that opened afterward. The king grew irritated. He dismissed it as scattered resistance, remnants of human guerrilla spirit. "A wolf may snap at your ankles," he told his council, "but a lion does not bleed." His words reassured no one. Meanwhile, Baba Yaga collected maps, not star charts, but floor plans, water lines, sewage routes, forgotten tunnels etched centuries ago when the Empire first built its spires. He learned how kitchens rotated shifts, how guard captains favored certain hallways, how servants whispered rumors in broom closets. He never threatened them. He never raised his voice. He only asked questions, and somehow people answered. They told him everything, because he listened the way no one else did, because he paid with kindness when the Empire paid with disdain. Still, kindness was not the trap. It was the bait. He began to strike, not with bullets but with fear. A patrol ship docked for repairs found its captain dead in his bunk, a coin pressed over each eye, an Earth custom no one understood. A high-ranking official woke to find her guards unconscious, her datapad stolen, and her walls painted with a single line in human script: "Every empire falls." When she demanded to know what it meant, a human diplomat explained politely its history. Alien diplomats began to murmur uneasily at banquets. Was this man acting alone? Was humanity stirring beneath its treaties? No one could answer. The humans who spoke publicly only smiled and sipped their drinks, pretending to misunderstand. But their eyes, polite and calm, betrayed something older. The girl, still healing, heard whispers of her father's movement. She was not surprised. She had grown up with his silences, his meticulous habits, the way he never entered a room without marking every exit. Once as a child, she had asked why he always sat with his back to the wall. He had smiled faintly and said, "Because walls don't stab you in the dark." She had laughed then, but now she understood. She begged to join him, but he refused. Not with words, he rarely wasted those, but with a look that said, "Not yet." The Empire tried to lure him out. They staged public parades, baiting him with displays of power. Fleets in formation, banners unfurled, speeches about discipline. He never appeared. Instead, supply lines collapsed behind them. Communications scrambled, engines fused. Fleets returned hungry, thirsty, humiliated. And always at the edges of every disaster, someone swore they saw a human in a black coat walking away. Humor followed him like shadows. On one planet, guards discovered a crate of explosives replaced with rubber ducks. On another, an entire fleet's targeting systems were hacked to broadcast a human song, an old Earth ballad about heartbreak and whiskey, on every frequency. The aliens laughed at first, then stopped when they realized their codes had been cracked so easily. Baba Yaga understood the power of laughter. Nothing unnerved tyrants more than being turned into clowns. When at last the Empire caught a glimpse of him, it was on the desert world of Valas, where enforcers cornered him in a marketplace. Dozens of them surrounded him, staves humming. He smiled, raised his hands politely, and asked if anyone had a lighter. They sneered, demanded his surrender. He sighed, muttered, "Guess not," and in the next heartbeat, the marketplace erupted. Stalls collapsed in orchestrated chains, sand burst from hidden charges, smoke swallowed the sky. When it cleared, the enforcers were unconscious, bound neatly with their own restraints. The human was gone. On the ground where he had stood lay a single matchstick. The incident rattled the king. He demanded to know how one man could dismantle squads, sabotage fleets, turn populations. His advisors whispered what he refused to say. It wasn't one man. It was humanity. The Baba Yaga was merely the spark, the face of something far older, far more patient. Still, the king scoffed. "A story," he insisted. "We rule with fleets, not fears." But fear was already spreading. Entire planets began to refuse imperial taxes, claiming they had no deliveries left to give. Mercenaries stopped answering contracts. Smugglers turned their routes toward Earth, trading in human relics no one had valued before. A single cigarette lighter from New York fetched more than an imperial jewel. The galaxy had learned to see humanity not as novelty, but as omen. In the halls of power, ambassadors whispered that the king should apologize, make amends, return the girl untouched. But arrogance was a crown heavier than wisdom. The king doubled down, declaring publicly that humans were pests to be eradicated, a minor inconvenience to be erased. He promised their extinction. His words broadcast across 1,000 systems. And somewhere, listening to that speech, Baba Yaga smiled. He was no longer setting traps. He was closing them. On the mining moon, tunnels collapsed at just the right time, swallowing enforcer regiments. On the desert world, water supplies were poisoned, not lethally, but enough to keep soldiers sick and weak. On an oceanic station, docking clamps failed, dropping entire gunships into black waves. None of it was random. Every failure was timed, measured, and orchestrated. Alien species began to realize the pattern. Every strike brought the human closer, not to destruction, but to a path. Like dominoes, one toppled into the next, leading inexorably toward the heart of the empire. And then came the clearest message yet. In the grand hall of the king's palace, as nobles feasted beneath crystal chandeliers, a servant wheeled in a covered tray. The lid lifted, steam rose, and inside was not food, but a simple, battered coffee mug. The same mug that had once sat on a cabin table. Inside was black liquid still warm, untouched. Beneath it lay a note written in human script. Still hot. Good. The hall erupted in panic. The king roared, demanding executions, purges, assurances. But no one knew how the tray had arrived. No one had seen the servant's face. And by the time the guards overturned every dish, the mug was gone. The king had wanted a war. He was getting one. Only it wasn't the war he imagined. Armies clashing, fleets burning. It was quieter, sharper, deadlier. It was a wolf already inside his walls, padding closer, closer, with a patience that mocked crowns and fleets alike. The girl dreamed of her father that night. She saw him walking calmly through fire, coat brushing embers, eyes unblinking. She tried to call out, but he only looked at her and said, "Almost there." And in the waking world, in a corridor no map recorded, Baba Yaga traced his hand along a wall, counting steps. He had already marked the last door. The king's head still rested on his shoulders. But for the first time in his reign, he found himself touching his throat when no one watched. The empire had grown accustomed to fear, but this fear was different. It was not the chaos of rebellion or the roar of invasion fleets. It was quiet, systematic, and patient. It crept through corridors, sat in the dark corners of banquet halls, rode home with soldiers who found themselves glancing over their shoulders though no one followed. This was not the fear of losing a battle. It was the fear of being hunted. Baba Yaga had shed humor as one sheds a coat. His smile still appeared, faint and polite, but it no longer carried warmth. Now it was a mask that unsettled even those who did not know his name. He moved with the inevitability of weather, his steps careful, his eyes always measuring. He was no longer baiting the empire. He was teaching them what it meant to be prey. The first revelation came on Dazrim Prime, a fortress world thought impenetrable. Its defenses were triple-layered, orbital cannons, planetary shields, and an army garrisoned in tiers like a pyramid of steel. Yet when the generals awoke one morning, the cannons were silent, their barrels clogged with resin that hardened like stone. The shields blinked out with a sigh, not an explosion. The army marched out to investigate, only to find every one of their rations replaced with fresh loaves of bread stamped with a human smiley face. The soldiers starved not from hunger, but from terror, refusing to eat, convinced the bread itself was poisoned. Whispers spread faster than news. Some said he could turn invisible. Others claimed he had armies hidden in shadow, millions of humans bred in secret caverns. A few swore they had seen him walk directly into a fleet formation and leave untouched, as if the universe itself conspired to move him along. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. He had patience, and he understood weakness better than the empire understood strength. His daughter, now fully healed, left the med bay against orders. She searched for him, not to stop him, but to understand. She found only echoes, markets that fell silent when she entered, soldiers who looked away when she asked questions, corridors still humming with the residue of dread. Yet everywhere she turned, someone whispered the same thing: "He's close." The girl knew what that meant. Close was never a measurement of distance. Close was a feeling, like a breath against the back of your neck. It was the pause before the strike, the heartbeat before the knife. She had grown up watching her father set traps for no reason but teaching. How to rig a door to creak only when opened too quickly. How to place a mirror so you could see someone entering behind you. He had told her then, the difference between predator and prey is who notices first. The Empire noticed too late. When their fleets rallied at Juno's Gate, the largest warp corridor in the quadrant, they came prepared for open war. Hundreds of ships, shields charged, cannons primed. They broadcast their strength on every frequency, announcing to the galaxy that they would end the humans' farce in a single sweep. But when the Armada leapt, their coordinates scattered. Instead of one fleet, hundreds of isolated ships materialized in dead sectors, some colliding with asteroids, others drifting into black holes mapped centuries ago. A human voice crackled across their comms. Checkmate's not about the last move. It's about the 20 before. Entire systems fell quiet after that. Not because Baba Yaga had burned them, but because no one knew whose side their neighbors were on. The Empire had built itself on dominance, never on loyalty. Under the weight of silence and dread, loyalty shifted. Miners armed themselves. Smugglers closed routes. Mercenaries suddenly refused contracts. Each claimed to have seen a man in a black coat. Each swore he had looked them in the eyes and said nothing, yet somehow they understood what he demanded. In one palace corridor, a senator whispered, "He's not killing to kill. He's choosing." That was when they began to understand the trap was not designed for soldiers or ships. It was designed for the king. Every step had been measured to isolate him, to erode his confidence, to show the galaxy what happened when arrogance struck the wrong family. Still, the king laughed. He drank wine from crystal goblets, sat on a throne of sapphire, and mocked the whispers. "A man cannot kill a crown," he said. But when the room fell silent, when even his guards did not echo his laughter, he realized too late that he was the only one left who believed it. Baba Yaga's daughter finally caught his trail on the ash world of Marrow. She found a room littered with dismantled weapons, each piece cleaned, polished, and placed in precise rows. He was sitting at the far end, his back to the wall, locket resting in his hand. She entered without knocking. He did not look up, but he knew. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. "I had to be," she answered. "They hurt me, not you. It should be my fight." He closed the locket with a click. "It's not about hurt. It's about memory. They need to remember." Her voice wavered. "Remember what?" He finally looked at her, and she saw not her father, but something older. His eyes were steady, his face unreadable, but in the silence between his words she felt the weight of entire wars. That humans are polite because it's easier, not because we have to be. The words chilled her more than any weapon could. She had always known he was dangerous. She had never realized how much of that danger was restrained by choice. The empire's unraveling accelerated. A governor who once boasted of feeding prisoners to hounds was found hanging upside down from his own gates, alive but babbling nonsense about footsteps in the dark. An admiral discovered her flagship had been stripped in orbit, every cannon, every engine, gone, the skeleton left drifting while her crew slept. On the grand market world of Alaver, citizens awoke to find the statue of the king replaced overnight with a crude stone carving of a human skull. None had seen the exchange. None dared to ask how. Alien councils convened, frantic. Some demanded the king abdicate, others that Earth be quarantined entirely, destroyed if necessary. Yet none moved decisively. Fear eroded unity faster than any weapon. Baba Yaga did not need to fight them all. He only needed to watch them crumble while he walked forward. He walked with purpose now. The jokes, the rubber ducks, the harmless laughter, they had been preludes, the teasing scratches of claws at the edge of the dark. Now came the silence. He entered strongholds without killing a single guard, leaving only fear carved into walls. He let prisoners free, not because he cared for their causes, but because chaos multiplied his shadow. The daughter followed as far as she dared. She saw him move through firestorms, through blockades, through halls of enemies who fell unconscious at his passing. She wanted to shout, to tell him to stop, to remind him that she was alive, that vengeance had already been answered. But each time she drew breath, the words died. Because she understood, this was no longer about her. This was about the empire learning what line it should never have crossed. By the time the king finally admitted danger, his court was half empty, his fleets crippled, his people whispering of betrayal. He summoned his strongest enforcers, warriors bred for brutality. They swore loyalty, but when the night grew deep and footsteps echoed outside the throne, not one of them slept. They sat trembling, waiting for a door to creak, for a shadow to fall. And then it happened. The palace lights died, one by one, snuffed like candles. The guards screamed orders, weapons crackled, but the air itself felt heavy. Silence spread in ripples. The king rose, robe dragging, and shouted into the dark, "Face me, human, if you dare." His voice shook more than he intended. The darkness gave no answer, only the faintest sound of leather boots across marble. Baba Yaga entered without fanfare, without spectacle. Just a man in a coat, steps calm, eyes steady. He looked more like a tired father than a legend, but every creature in that hall felt their bones clench as if death itself had arrived. The king tried to sneer. "You think one man can tear down an empire?" Baba Yaga tilted his head, polite, almost amused. "No, just a man with a reason." The guards moved first. They lunged, staves raised, but the strikes never landed. Not because he moved fast, though he did, but because he moved with inevitability. Each guard fell not with screams, but with thuds, their weapons sliding harmlessly across marble. The king stumbled backward, crown rattling, as his throne room filled with silence. It was not a battle. It was a reminder. When it was done, Baba Yaga stood alone amid unconscious bodies, coat untouched. He did not raise a weapon toward the king. Instead, he walked to the throne, sat down, and poured himself a goblet of the king's wine. He tasted it, grimaced faintly, and muttered, "Too sweet." The king trembled, eyes wide, as Baba Yaga leaned forward, voice low but carrying through the chamber. "You wanted a war. You forgot who we are. We are not lions. We are not wolves. We are the storm that taught those beasts to fear. The daughter, standing hidden at the edge of the hall, felt her chest tighten. He had never spoken so much at once. Each word dripped not with rage, but with certainty. The king tried to answer, but his voice failed. And in that silence, Baba Yaga smiled faintly. Not warm, not kind. Just final. Now, he whispered, setting the goblet down, I'm ready. The throne chamber still smelled of wine and fear. Guards lay in broken heaps along the walls, their weapons silent, their armor gleaming faintly under the flicker of failing chandeliers. The king stood frozen on the dais, crown crooked, robe dragging in spilled goblets, staring at the man who had dared to sit on his throne. Baba Yaga sat easily, one leg crossed over the other, a shadow stretching long behind him. He looked more like a man resting after a long walk than a predator surrounded by prey, but the stillness in his eyes told a different story. You think you can frighten me with silence, the king spat, though his voice cracked. You are a human, nothing more. A story whispered in the dark. Baba Yaga tilted his head slightly, as if listening to the words like music, patient and calm. Then he leaned forward, elbows on knees, and spoke with the softness of a father correcting a child. I don't need you to be frightened. I just need you to listen. The king's lips parted, but no words came. No one had ever spoken to him that way. Not his council, not his generals, not even rivals who had once wielded fleets. He felt smaller with every syllable, as if the throne beneath him were suddenly too large. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint drip of spilled wine. Then Baba Yaga rose. Slowly, deliberately, coat brushing the marble, boots echoing like a metronome, counting down the last moments of certainty. He did not draw a weapon. His presence was weapon enough. The daughter stepped closer from the shadows where she had hidden. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had seen him train, seen him move with precision, but never like this. The air itself bent around his stillness, and every step toward the king felt like gravity pulling a body to its inevitable fall. She wanted to cry out, to tell him to stop, that she was safe, alive, that vengeance had already been taken. But her throat closed. This was no longer her fight. It was his truth made flesh. The king rallied what little arrogance he had left. He raised his hand, summoning the last of his guards. They stumbled into the chamber, wide-eyed, clutching their weapons with trembling claws. More came behind them, ranks filling the space, surrounding the man in black. The chamber swelled with bodies, shields raised, the hum of energy weapons filling the silence. The king straightened his crown and sneered. You see, human? One man cannot face an empire. Baba Yaga looked around, gaze drifting across the sea of soldiers. He did not flinch. He smiled, faint and polite, as though amused at the effort. Then he murmured, barely above a whisper, Good. More witnesses. The words rippled like a blade across water. The soldiers shifted uneasily, their lines faltering. And then the lights died. Darkness swallowed the throne room, broken only by the glow of trembling weapons. Boots scuffed, armor clanged, breaths quickened. In that void, sound became sharper. The scrape of leather, the click of a pistol, the faint whisper of a coat brushing stone. Then chaos erupted. Soldiers lunged, but none struck true. They fired into shadows, blasts sizzling against marble. Bodies dropped one after another, not dead, but unconscious, their weapons stripped from their hands before they even hit the ground. A flash of metal gleamed, then vanished. A cry cut short, followed by silence. The chamber became a theater of dread, each soldier knowing their turn would come, none able to stop it. The king backed away, his crown slipping, his hand clutching the throne as if it could anchor him. He watched as his strongest protectors fell like dominoes, silent, efficient, inevitable. The human moved not like a warrior, but like inevitability itself. Patience sharpened into violence, each strike placed as though written long before tonight. The daughter watched with wide eyes, torn between awe and horror. This was no longer just her father. This was the Baba Yaga, the whispered story, the myth made real. And yet, beneath every strike, she still saw the man who had tucked her in at night, who had brewed coffee in silence, who had smiled faintly when she asked childish questions about the world. He had always been this, but now the galaxy was being forced to see it too. One by one, the soldiers dropped until none remained standing. The chamber was a graveyard of unconscious bodies, their armor reflecting the dim glow of dying torches. Baba Yaga stood in the center, coat unruffled, eyes steady. He turned toward the dais. The king stumbled backward until his robe tangled at his feet. He collapsed onto the steps of the throne, crown clattering away, rolling to rest against a soldier's helmet. His voice cracked as he spoke. Why? Why destroy everything for one girl? Baba Yaga's expression didn't change. He walked slowly up the steps, each stride heavier than any roar of cannons. When he reached the king, he crouched low, meeting his gaze. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of centuries. Not for one girl, for the line you crossed, for the arrogance that thought a family was yours to wound, for every time you believed humans were too small to matter. The king's lips trembled. You lend everything. Do you even know what comes after me? Baba Yaga studied him, head tilted, as though considering a puzzle. Then he whispered, yes. Silence. The king lunged, desperation burning, snatching a blade from the floor. He swung clumsily, the arc wild, but Baba Yaga caught his wrist mid-swing. The blade hovered inches from his throat, trembling, powerless. With a twist, the weapon clattered to the ground. The king screamed, a pitiful sound that echoed off marble and chandeliers alike. And then it ended. The daughter saw it clearly, though she would never describe it in full. One moment the king sat trembling, the next his crownless head rolled across the steps, eyes still wide with disbelief. The chamber fell silent, but for the drip of blood pooling at the dais. Baba Yaga rose, calm as dawn, and wiped his hands against his coat. He did not look at the body. He looked only at his daughter. For the first time that night, his eyes softened. He spoke quietly, words meant only for her, though the entire chamber felt them. It's done. But she shook her head, voice barely a whisper. No, it's only begun. Because outside those walls, the galaxy shifted. Word of the king's fall spread like fire through dry fields. To some, it was liberation. To others, terror. Fleets disbanded, governors fled, systems declared independence overnight. The empire cracked not from invasion, but from the weight of its own fear, split wide open by the reminder that humans did not forgive trespasses against blood. Baba Yaga walked down the steps, his boots echoing steady against marble. He did not rush, did not celebrate. He simply moved as if the world had already accepted its new truth. When he reached the shattered gates, he paused. He turned back once, gaze brushing the fallen throne, the body sprawled against stone. Then he left. The daughter followed in silence. She had no words to give, no plea that could change what had been set in motion. She only walked behind him, small against the shadow he cast, and wondered if the galaxy would ever understand that this was not rage, not chaos, not madness. This was inevitability. They stepped into the night air, the palace behind them already trembling with panic. Across the horizon, the stars glittered indifferent, but every eye in the galaxy now looked upon Earth with new weight. The humans had been underestimated, laughed at, dismissed. Tonight they were remembered. Baba Yaga lit a cigarette, the ember glowing faint against the dark. He took a slow drag, exhaled smoke, and muttered almost casually, "Coffee's going to taste better tomorrow." The daughter shivered at the quiet humor, because she knew it was not a joke. It was a warning. And as the palace bells tolled, as the crownless king's head lay cooling on the marble floor, a new silence spread across the galaxy, one that whispered of storms not yet finished.